Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 2016 Q&A call for the aEEG coach group. And I'm excited to have a couple people joining us this morning who submitted cases for us to just have a really quick discussion. So we have Gabriel, who is joining us from Brazil, and we have also Mary from California. And the first case, I think, Gabriel, maybe you're advancing these slides. I'm not sure. But anyways, can we go back to the case presentation? I'll control them here for a sec. So the first case was a case that was presented by Mary from California, and this is a 28-weeker who was coded at birth, had low APGARs and low blood sugars and high frequency. I'm not quite sure why these slides keep advancing. So I'm going to just go ahead and take back control of that really quickly. All right, so again, 28-weeker, low APGARs and low blood sugars, high frequency ventilation, as well as monitored the baby for 3 days. The question was they thought there was some seizure activity, but the raw EEG didn't always look like seizures. And there was also a question about whether or not to treat based on aEEG, or should you get a full diagnostic EEG. So I think these are great questions and kind of a good example of the case. So let me show you a few of the actual aEEGs. So this is one of the first ones they sent, and you have here the aEEG left and right at the top, and you have left and right EEG at the bottom. And it's hard to tell on this particular device, but I believe that the aEEG that is, or the EEG that is being displayed is actually where there is the right hand margin. So they're kind of in this period where there's these disruptions. So I asked this person who sent this to me to send me also the impedance. And so I was not clear whether or not they were actually using needles or hydrogel. So it was that always is an important feature to understand what is the background impedance before you get too far into your interpretation. So at the very top, we see there's these little notations. There are some little stars and then some words. So there's like a star that says InfoSurf. There's some stars that say chest X-ray and stars that say electrodes. And I'm not sure if that means electrode manipulation or repositioning or what. But let's just go through and kind of talk about the systematic way that we review aEEG. So first off, we always want to know the baby's story. This is a preterm baby, had a rough start, and we're monitoring for 3 days. The baby's on high frequency, which we know always complicates interpretation. And then we also know that there was some suspicious areas for seizures. So we know the baby's story, kind of the background. We don't know the signal quality, and that's a really important thing to know, because if the impedance is too high, meaning greater than 10 microvolt or 10 kiloohms, we don't want to interpret the aEEG. Then we want to begin to look at things like the background pattern, whether or not we see sleep-wake cycling, whether or not we see symmetry, and whether or not we see seizures. So, of course, this is a preterm baby, so the type of background pattern we expect is a discontinuous pattern. We don't expect a flat tracing. We don't expect seizures, although the case itself warrants that there is a risk for seizures. And so without knowing the impedance values, it's hard to really interpret this. We also know the baby was on high frequency, but it doesn't seem to be really affecting the band that much. We do see a couple areas along on the right EEG where there's a little bit of jaggedness on a couple of these waveforms, which would make you think that there is probably some breakthrough. So we can look at the far left side of this aEEG and we can see that there's some for the first maybe 10, 15 minutes, it's an okay tracing where there's not really any disruptions to the background. There's some lower margins greater than 5, but the upper margin is not really ever reaching 10 until we get to the segment where the monitor has marked it as seizure. Then it shifts back down and it comes back up. It's a kind of a messy trace. There's certainly some areas that are suspicious, but certainly there are also some areas that are marked by the nurses with chest X-ray and electrode repositioning that kind of rule out those areas as areas that we would really maybe want to interpret. So I think mostly this is too disrupted to probably really accurately assess. At the very end of this tracing, after the chest X-ray and the electrodes are repositioned, the tracing is actually quite ugly in the sense of pathological, where you see the lower margin is less than 5 and kind of flattened out, and then there is these occasional bursts. So this brain is very unwell, and certainly near the end we begin to see a little bit of a shifting up, and then but yet we see this pattern of rhythmic activity. So certainly suspicious for some sort of seizure potentially happening, but difficult without knowing the true impedance to be able to say. Gabriel, you have a lot of experience monitoring preterm babies. I don't know if you can unmute your line or if you want to just text chat anything in, any comments. Not looking like I can unmute you for some reason, but okay. So next one. So the previous was 4-9 at 1700 to 2000. So this is 4-9 from 1600 to 1800. So it's the previous 3 hours. And on this case, I just wanted to just kind of note again this very low, extremely low voltage tracing. Is it's not burst suppression because it's not even reaching 25. So let's see. Gabriel had said it's very common during long monitoring, but definitely do not look like seizures. Yeah, it's definitely a pathological trace. So Gabriel's just texting in that they don't look like seizures, but it's definitely a pathological trace. So we see here that we've got this very low voltage pattern, and then I want to just again draw your attention to the very top where you see that the nurse or the bedside care provider was noting that the baby got cares and Infisurf. So the baby was having a lot of handling, which was happening, which is probably causing this uprising that we see at 1700. So for the next 20-ish minutes, which kind of correlates with what we would expect. And then we see care provided there at, 1530 and that uprising there. So a lot of disruptions to the it's a little disruptions to the baseline there. I'm just reading what Gabriel is saying. So it's, oh gosh, okay. I don't know why I can't promote you so you can talk. Oh, because you're on the mobile, it won't let me. All right, I'm sorry. So again, just looking at the EEG, it has some spikes, but I don't think, again, they don't look like the classic spike wave. Certainly rhythmic, but again, difficult to know what exactly was happening in that moment. And I see, again, the breakthrough of some high frequency as well. This one is a better example of the high frequency kind of breakthrough on the left EEG. And certainly there are these areas that are definitely recurring every hour or hour or multiple times per hour, these areas where you see the upper and the lower margin shifting, definitely against a very bad background pattern. I would have liked to see some of these areas in a little more detail, but certainly I think this baby warrants a full EEG and a more detailed assessment. I wouldn't necessarily load or treat based on this, but certainly it does make me very suspicious. The difficulty in the NICU is with so much artifact, and without video, it's very hard to say what's going on. But this is definitely, now we're on the next day, April 10th at 9 a.m., and we see these disruptions that are persisting repetitively and make me very, very suspicious of seizures without seeing each of them individually. It's hard to say. The other thing I'm just noticing is that the EEG is set for a plus or minus 100. And when the voltages are so low, I would recommend that you toggle this EEG to probably plus or minus 50 so that you're able to actually tune in a little bit better to the spike waves if they're happening in any of these areas. So that's just a little note that you can't adjust the aEEG on this particular device, but you can adjust the EEG scale. And for a baby who has such a low background pattern, I would recommend that you definitely get this scaled in. And I think based on just the voltages, the background voltages alone, and the history, that a full EEG is warranted. And here is more on the baby having hiccups and baby having cares provided, but still this very, very low voltage, almost flat tracing, except for these periods of uprising, which are very worrisome. So this particular case came from Gabriel, who's on the phone. He's a neonatologist from Brazil. And his basic question, I think, was just to look at the background pattern. So it was a term baby, and the baby was born and intubated, had AFGARs of 4 and 7. The x-ray was fine. He was extubated on the second day of life. He seemed to still remain agitated and hypertonic, and he stopped moving and had these periods of apnea. Because of these recurrent apneas on the third day of life, he was re-intubated, and seventh day of life was extubated. And then 2 days later, so around day 9 of life, was intubated again due to apneas. He's negative for infection, and he does get agitated, has flexed hands, hypertonia, so just some really flexion, and then again stopping to breathe. So these apnea periods, and he was scheduled for an MRI, which I'm not sure if he knows the results of those yet, since this was just last week. So he uses a different kind of device, so you may have not seen this kind of an aEEG before, but this just goes back to the conversation from last month that the aEEG is just amplitude integrated EEG, can come in the form of many different monitor types. And one of the things that he was remarking on about this tracing, he's noting that the MRI is normal, so that's excellent. And I think the first thing we all notice right away is that there is there's a very narrowness of the aEEG band, but certainly there is still periods of alternating patterns between kind of continuous and not even maybe quite discontinuous, but certainly showing these periods of widening of the tracing. And one of the things that was concerning, or just of a question that Gabriel brought up, was whether or not it's normal to see this margins of the EEG to be so high. So, seeing this aEEG be, kind of at 10 for the minimum and more like 25 for the maximum. And I noted that I do see this from time to time, but mostly in older babies, not always in babies who are just, right at term or 41 weeks even. I usually see this more heightened pattern when they're closer to 44, 45 weeks. at which point you start to see the alternating patterns kind of disappear as they transition into a different sleep pattern at around 44 weeks. So definitely some hyper-irritability of the brain for some reason, and it's not infectious, so we know that. I don't see any areas that look like seizures, but otherwise it looks just like a, kind of a higher than normal background pattern, but still very normal. So continuous normal voltage really is defined only as the minimum greater than 5 and the maximums greater than 10. And although we don't oftentimes see such a mature trace for a baby so young, I don't think that there's any other concern. I have seen it in babies withdrawing. Sometimes they're hyper irritable and you see these margins a little elevated. And certainly if the kids are 6 or 8 weeks old, we see these margins. But again, at 6 and 8 weeks, we don't see these beautiful sleep-wake cycling that I see here. So I think these are sleep-wake cycling. I think because they're so elevated that you've gotten yourself above the 10. And because of once you're over 10, so the question was the sleep-wake cycling, it doesn't look like the typical widening, but I think it's because the margins are starting above 10 to start with, that when you start to see that, remembering that over 10 it becomes logarithmic, there's just so much more compression. And so even though he's doing nice sleep cycling, it doesn't look very wide because the way that the graphing is standard. So I think, you can definitely see it maybe in the second channel of the aEEG. It's a little bit lower and you can see the widening out a fair bit more because it's dropping so much more below the 10, and you can see it widen. When his sleep cycles stay closer to 10 or 12, I think we're not seeing that nice thickness that we're used to because the margins are so high. I can't remember if you said he was on high frequency, but it looks like he's intubated in this image, which that could also cause a drift of the margins if he was having some background artifact. Could definitely pull that up. I don't see a ton of artifact in the EEG snapshot that you sent, so I'm less worried about that. Of note as well is that Gabriel uses a frontal parietal configuration for his monitoring. And so originally I had asked whether or not just the distance between these leads might have caused this increase, because it was a higher than normal trace, which we sometimes see if the electrodes are really wide. But then he followed up and sent me this additional tracing where the top of the aEEG is actually the P3, P4, and you can see that they're all quite similar. So sometimes we may see, if we have long electrode distances, we may see an elevated margin, and if we look at P3, P4, because they're closer, sometimes we see something different. But in this case, it stays pretty true all the way through, which is also interesting, but I mean, it is what it is. What can we do about it? It's still normal. And Gabriel's saying at first he was on CPAP and then conventional, so no high frequency disruption. But you can certainly see in this EEG that it's quite active. There's a lot of activity. For our babies, we don't always see this much activity. So certainly it does have a lot of background activity, which is causing this narrowing of the aEEG. So, but I think it is completely normal for age. So these are some really great tracings. I think it illuminates some of the kind of common questions. We monitor and then there are these very kind of different tracings that pop up for us, and I think it's good to share them and to have a short discussion about them, and even just to kind of validate what you're thinking and feeling in your own practice. So thank you, everyone, for offering to share these with us. And I don't know, Gabriel, if you have any other comments. I know you're texting in on your phone. So I think just in summary, the first case for the 28-weeker had lower than expected voltages for age, certainly had some areas that seemed suspicious. The pattern itself, if we just look at pattern and we don't look at the EEG, the pattern itself is extremely worrisome. The pattern with the disruptions that are happening frequently based on the history certainly makes this baby very much at risk for seizures. So I wouldn't have hesitated to get more assessments, get a deeper, and get some more information as well as a consultation with your neurologist about the benefits versus the risk of treating a baby that's in that condition. And then the second tracing just is a great example of just as infants are a little bit older, sometimes we see the tracings be a little higher, but that we're, again, looking at just the overall pattern and seeing this nice narrowing and thickness, maybe not to the degree that we're used to, but certainly seeing it in a nice 1 per hour, which is always a really good sign that I look for sleep-wake patterns. So some great traces. And next month, due to our holiday in the U.S., we will be moving our aEEG call to Tuesday instead of Monday. It will be on May 31st, same time, 8 a.m. Pacific, and we'll be sending out reminders. And if Gabriel has any update on this baby, maybe he'll send it in if there's any new news. And same with Mary, maybe perhaps you can send in some updates on this tracing. So thank you all for sending this in and for sharing your experience with aEEG, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Take care. Bye-bye.